during the year, from the summer of 1941 to the summer of 1942. At the same time as its diplomatic activities were unfolding, battleground France itself did not cease to expand. If I am here setting out these two lines of our work separately. In fact, they were both going on simultaneously and jointly. But as our field of activity began to expand, it became necessary for me to put at the head of the movement a body corresponding to the new tasks. De Gaulle alone could no longer manage. The problems before us multiplied and became more complex, the solution of which required the comparison of different opinions of knowledgeable and experienced people. There was a need for some decentralization in the implementation of decisions. Finally, since collegial methods are generally used in the public administration of all states, it would be easier for us to gain recognition if we adopted these methods ourselves. By decree of September 24, 1941, I established the National Committee. To tell the truth, from the very beginning I had not given up thinking about the establishment of such a body. But I had to postpone this plan partly because I had to spend 8 months in Africa and the East during the last year, but above all because of the shortage of so-called representative persons. When I returned to London after the events in Syria, I was already able to begin the long organizational work. Moreover, while most of the figures who joined me were not known to many people at the beginning, some of them have since gained popularity. Thus, I had the opportunity to create a committee of reputable persons. I believe that, in relation to the movement of France battles, the National Committee should exercise leadership and unite around me. At its meetings, the commissioners would be able to discuss all our affairs together. Each of them would be assigned one of the departments in charge of a certain area of our activities. The decisions made are binding on all of us. In general, the committee should fulfill the functions of the government. It will have the same rights and the same structure as the government, but it must not be called a government, for that is the name I've retained until the time, however remote, when it will be possible to establish a governmental body representing the whole of France. It was with this in mind that I provided in my decree for the future formation of a consultative assembly, which should represent French public opinion as widely as possible under the National Committee. It was a long time, however, before this assembly was to see the light of day. As might have been expected, my decision created excitement among small groups of Frenchmen who, while claiming a political role, had been somewhat active in England and the United States. These people were willing to accept that de Gaulle act as a soldier and provide the Allies with the assistance of the French armed forces, but they could not allow the head of the Free French to assume the responsibility of statesmanship. By refusing to join me, they challenged my authority, and for the future of France they preferred to rely on foreigners Roosevelt, Churchill, or Stalin. I confess that there was an irreconcilable contradiction between the views of these men and mine. From my point of view, a simple and compelling idea should underlie political action in this national tragedy. They, on the other hand, surrendering themselves to their usual idle reveries, believed that our activities should be nothing more than a corpse of party opinions and combinations played out by professional actors, and that the whole affair would come down to articles, speeches, oratory, and the allocation of seats. And although this regime was swept away by events and led France to a catastrophe from which it might have seemed she would never recover, and although these egregious politicians were deprived of their usual means of action, Parliament, Congresses, cabinets, editorial offices, they continued their game in New York and London, endeavouring to involve, for want of Frenchmen, Anglo-Saxon governments, deputies, and journalists, and the cause of some of the troubles that Free France was subjected to by its own allies, as well as the campaigns waged against it by their press and radio, was often the influence of certain French émigrés. These latter could not accept the political success which the establishment of the National Committee represented for Free France, and tried in every possible way to create obstacles. The instrument in their hands was Admiral Muselier. In the Admiral coexisted, as it were, two different men. As a naval commander, he possessed virtues which deserved profound respect, and to which we owed much of the organization of our modest naval forces. But from time to time he was troubled in some way, and then he would get into intrigues. As soon as he learned of my intention to form a committee, he wrote me a letter. While presenting himself as a champion of friendship with the Allies and Democrats, he asserted that my policy threatened that friendship, and in order to save both these strongholds from danger in the future, he proposed that I should reserve to myself only an honorary office, and that all actual power should devolve upon him. As to the means which he put in motion to induce me to consent, It was nothing less than the threat of secession of the Navy, which, as he declared on the telephone, would become independent and carry on the war. My decision was definite, and the discussion short. The Admiral relented, explaining it was all motivated by good feelings and considering the situation. I pretended to be persuaded by his explanation, listened to his promises, and appointed him Commissioner of the National Committee for the War and Merchant Marine. The functions in the National Committee were distributed as follows: Economy, Finance, Colonial Affairs, Pleven, Justice and Public Education Cassin, Foreign Affairs Degene, Land Forces Legentiam, Air Forces Valen, Liaison with the Metropolis, Labour, Information Dythelm, who had arrived shortly before from France. Catrou and Dargenlieu, who were on a business trip at the time, were appointed commissioners without portfolio. I entrusted Pleven with the coordination of the civil departments, provision for the employees of our organs, matters of their stationing and material support, the location of our organizations, etc. At first I had the intention of enlarging the committee by bringing in some French personalities who were living in America. I even took steps in this direction on several occasions. Thus, I extended an invitation to Maritain and Alexis Liga to participate in our work. I received very polite replies, but they were negative in substance. The work of the National Committee had already settled down when Muselier provoked a new crisis. Returning to London after the successful expedition to St. Pierre, with which we all unanimously congratulated him, he declared at a meeting of the committee on March 3 that things were not going as he wished in Free France, and announced his resignation as National Commissioner, which he formally informed me in a letter. I accepted the resignation, dismissed him to the reserve of the command, and appointed Obuano, who had been summoned from the Pacific, to take his place. Seeing this, Muselier declared that, though resigning from the National Committee, he retained supreme command of the Navy. As if our Navy was his domain and he could dispose of it as he pleased? This, of course, we could not allow, and the matter was already essentially settled, when suddenly the British government intervened. This intervention had been long in preparation. Its inspirers were some restless elements of the French emigration, as well as certain representatives of the House of Commons and the English Navy. The conspirators secured the assistance of Alexander, the Navy. As minister, they presented the case to him in such a way that if Muselier left, the Free French Navy would be completely disorganized, and the English Royal Navy would lose no small amount of support. As Labour, they sought to impress upon him that de Gaulle and his committee were gravitating toward fascism, and that it was necessary to free the French Navy from their influence. The British cabinet, anxious to maintain the internal balance of power, and also apparently trying to make de Gaulle more compliant by weakening his position, supported Alexander's view. He decided to demand that I retain Muselier as Commander-in-Chief of the Free France Navy. On March 5 and 6, Eden and Alexander informed me of this demand by note. From that moment the matter was finally settled for me. It was necessary at all costs to carry out the decision of the National Committee, and it was necessary to make England refuse to interfere in French affairs. On March 8, I wrote to Eden that both myself and the National Committee had decided to remove Muselier from the post of Commander-in-Chief of the French Navy, and that we rejected all interference by the English government on this point. The Free French believe that their struggle for a common cause, in alliance with the English, implies that they should be treated as allies, and that English aid should not be accompanied by perpetual checks and restrictions, or granted on terms incompatible with their existence. If this were nevertheless to happen, General de Gaulle and the French National Committee would cease to struggle unsparingly to accomplish the task, for it would become impossible. Indeed, they consider it most essential, both for the future of France and for her present, to remain faithful to the goal they have set for themselves. That goal is the revival of France and the restoration of national unity in the war on the side of the Allies, but without sacrificing French independence, sovereignty, and national institutions. I did not receive the answer at once. Undoubtedly, before taking further action, the British wanted to wait and see how events would unfold in our fleet. But on no ship, in no crew, and in no fleet institution was there any manifestation of disagreement with our decision. On the contrary, from this ordeal, the French naval forces emerged even more united around de Gaulle. They were even more imbued with the determination to continue the struggle. Only a few officers, grouped around Admiral Muselier, organized a shameful performance in the Naval Headquarters building, where I went to talk to them personally. Thereupon I ordered the Admiral to remain for a month in a place from which he could not keep in touch with the fleet. Pursuant to the jurisdictional agreement of January 15, I requested the British government to enforce my decision, as it was made on British territory. Then, in view of the fact that appropriate assurances were still not forthcoming, I went to the country house, being prepared for everything and expecting the worst. To Pleven, Dythome and Coulays, I left a sort of secret political testament, instructing them to inform the French people of everything necessary, if I should be compelled to discontinue the activities I had begun and should be unable to give the necessary explanations myself. At the same time, I brought it to the attention of the Allies that, to my greatest regret, I would not be able to maintain relations with them until they themselves had fulfilled the obligations they had undertaken by virtue of the agreement between us. This was on the 23rd of March. Peake appeared to me on a visit. He handed me a note stating that his government did not insist on the retention of Muselier as Commander-in-Chief, and that it would see to it that for a month the Admiral could not communicate with representatives of the French Navy. At the same time, the British government recommended me to show him favourable treatment in view of his merits. Meanwhile, arrived from the Pacific, Obiano took command of the Navy. In May, I invited Admiral Muselier to come to me, wishing to give him an opportunity to continue his service, and to discuss with him the terms of the inspection tour which I had hoped to entrust to him. He did not appear. A few days later, this high officer, who had done much for our Navy, formally notified me that his association with Free France was over. I was very sad for him. After this unfortunate incident, nothing interfered with the normal activities of the London Committee, which the hostile propaganda sought to portray as a group of greedy politicians, as a bunch of fascist adventurers, as a rabble of frenzied propagandists in the communist spirit, but for which, I solemnly and resolutely declare, the most important thing was the good of the country and the state. The National Committee met at least once a week, in solemn surroundings, in the large room at Carlton Gardens, which was called the Clock Room. According to the order of the day, we heard reports from each commissioner on the affairs of his department, or on any other matter which he saw fit to raise. The committee read the documents and reports, discussed the issues at length, and took decisions which were formalized in minutes. These decisions were then communicated to our institutions and military units. No major decision was ever taken without prior discussion in the committee. The National Committee as a whole, as a collegial body, and each of its members individually, always gave me valuable assistance and loyal cooperation. Of course, I had to become personally acquainted with all important matters, but the burden on me was lessened by the fact that I was now surrounded and assisted by competent staff. Of course, these ministers, none of whom had ever held a prominent public position before, sometimes lacked the necessary authority and renown, but they managed to acquire both. Each of them, moreover, had valuable qualities and personal experience. On the whole, by serving on the committee, they helped to strengthen the influence of France's battleground. I often had to meet on the part of my staff, not opposition, of course, but objections or criticism of my intentions and actions. In difficult moments, when I was usually inclined to take decisive action, many members favoured compromise, but that was even a good thing. In the end, having made their case, no national commissioner ever challenged my final decision, and although opinions may have been divided at times, the responsibility rested entirely with me. In the struggle for liberation, I, poor fellow, always had to be ultimately responsible for everything. In France, the eyes of those who were more and more eager for active resistance were increasingly turned to me. In this was felt an increasingly clear response to my appeals. In this also was manifested a similarity of sentiment which seemed to me as necessary as it was exciting, seeing that the tendency of the French to disunion and disunity, which the oppressive regime imposed on them, was capable of generating disparate outbursts of indignation. I lived with one thought: to fuse them together in the interests of the resistance. Indeed, it was unity that determined the combat successes of the resistance, its national character, its international significance. Beginning in the summer of 1941, we gradually learned in various ways about everything that was happening in the metropolis. In addition to what could be read between the lines in the newspapers or from the radio broadcasts of both zones, we were constantly receiving very complete information in the form of our intelligence. The reports of some of our agents who had already begun to operate in the field, the testimonies of volunteers arriving daily from France, the messages that arrived through diplomatic channels, the statements of emigrants passing through Madrid, Lisbon, Tangier, or New York, and finally, in the form of letters which, by means of many tricks, were sent to them by the families and friends of the participants in the resistance. As a result, I had an accurate picture of the situation day by day. How many times, talking to compatriots who had just left their homeland where they were, however more or less occupied with their daily work and acquainted only with the life of their own town, I was convinced that, thanks to the numerous sources of information which were brought to us by an army of devoted people, I knew the situation in France better than anyone else. This in turn allowed me to conclude that the Vichy regime was decaying. The illusions about this regime were dissipated, above all German victory, which had been claimed as a matter of course to justify surrender, was becoming impossible after Russia, and then the United States had entered the war and England and Free France had proved their ability to resist. The assertion that it was necessary to accept the enslavement of the country to save material goods was ridiculous. For 1,500,000 of our men taken prisoner were not returning home. The Germans had practically annexed Alsace and Lorraine and administratively cut off the north of the country from the rest of the territory. The occupiers' seizures of money, raw materials, agricultural and industrial goods were depleting our economy, and an increasing number of Frenchmen were forced to work for Germany. Talk of defence of the French Empire against any enemy could no longer deceive anyone, since the French army and navy were forced to fight against the Allies and the Degaullers in Dakar, Gabon, Syria and Madagascar, while Germans and Italians from armistice commissions were freely disposed of in Algeria, Tunisia, Casablanca and Beirut. German planes landed at Aleppo and Damascus, and the Japanese occupied Tonkin and Cochinchina. Henceforth, battling France became the embodiment of all hopes for the return of overseas territories. She gradually established herself in equatorial Africa, the Oceania Islands, Pondicherry, the Levant, St. Pierre, Madagascar, and French Somalia. At the same time, it had already, in advance, adamantly asserted its unquestionable rights over North Africa, West Africa, the Antilles, and Indochina. As for the national revolution, with which the Vichy regime tried to cover up its own surrender, it seemed that the Vichyists were fond of reforms, some of which were useful in themselves. But in general they were discredited by the fact that their implementation was associated with the defeat and subjugation of France. The Vichyists talk of moral improvement and consolidation of power, even their undeniable attempts to bring order to social and economic life. In fact, expressed only in parades of legionnaires, the exaltation of Marshal Pétain, the creation of numerous commissions and committees, and in fact meant mean repression, the overpowering of the police and censorship, privileges and the existence of the black market. It ended with signs of confusion and discord in the Vichy leadership itself. Here is how events unfolded from the end of 1940 until the summer of 1942. The dismissal of Laval, the creation in Paris by Marcel D. Deloncle, Lucha, Marquet, Sorez and others National Popular Association, which, with the direct support of the occupiers, sharply attacked the government and led screaming propaganda in favour of cooperation with the Germans. Endless changes in the powers of Darlan, Ardennais Bauduin, Albertin Flandin, Peyrouton, Chevalier Achard and others, who one after another declared that the task entrusted to them was impossible. The mysterious and unexpected termination of the Riom process, the resignation of Weygand, Colette's assassination attempt on Laval, the latter's appointment as head of the government. Marshal Pétain himself openly recognized his desperate situation. "I feel a bad wind that blows from many parts of France," he said, speaking on the radio in August 1941. "Anxiety is taking hold of minds. Doubt is creeping into souls. The authority of the government is challenged. Orders are poorly carried out. A real malaise is gripping the French people." The following June, marking the second anniversary of his request for an armistice, he said in a speech broadcast over the radio, "I make no secret of the fact that my appeals have met with little response." As the bloated grandeur of the Vichy regime faded everywhere, pockets of resistance emerged in the metropolis. Naturally, these were actions very different in character, often not very clearly defined, but pursuing a single goal. In one place, leaflets of all kinds were compiled, printed, and distributed. In another, they collected intelligence information about the enemy. Courageous people created action groups that performed a variety of tasks. Raids on the enemy, destruction of property, receiving and distributing supplies that were dropped by parachute or delivered by other means, crossing from one zone to another, receiving or sending agents, crossing the border, etc. In a number of places, the germs of resistance organizations were created, the members of which were united among themselves, either on the instructions of higher authorities or because of common views. In a word, behind the outward passivity and inactivity that seemed to reign in the metropolis, the resistance began to live its active underground life. Resistance fighters in France were now preparing to strike at the enemy, despite the dense network of policemen and informers. In September 1941, a series of isolated attacks on German soldiers began. The first to be killed were the commandant of the garrison in Nantes, an officer in Bordeaux, and 2 soldiers in Paris, on the Rue de Championnet. Then the number of killed began to increase. In revenge on the French, the enemy shot hostages by the hundreds, imprisoned thousands of patriots who were then expelled from France, smothered them with fines, and repressed the cities where assassination attempts were made. It was with a sense of grim pride that we learned of this war of loners, who had put themselves at great risk fighting the occupiers. On the other hand, the deaths of French victims of retaliatory German repression caused sorrow in our hearts, but not despair, because we regarded it as the death of soldiers on the battlefield. However, based on the elementary requirements of military science, we believed that the struggle must be led, and that, moreover, the moment had not yet come to begin open hostilities in the metropolis. A struggle designed to keep the enemy at bay, followed by active operations of the internal resistance forces in the designated points, and finally by a national uprising, which we intended to launch at the proper moment, could be very effective, provided that all this could be realized as a whole in conjunction with the actions of the armies of liberation. Meanwhile, in 1941, the resistance was barely in its infancy, and, on the other hand, we knew that it could be completely defeated literally years before our allies were ready to land on the coast. That is why, on October 23, I said on the radio, the fact that the French are killing Germans is absolutely normal and absolutely justified. If the Germans do not want us to kill them, they should stay at home. After they have failed to conquer the world, every German knows that he will become either a corpse or a prisoner. But there are tactics of warfare. The war must be led by those to whom it is entrusted. Certain at present, and my order for the occupied territory. It is caused by a single considerant. Now the enemy can carry out massacres of our as yet unarmed fighters quite freely. On the contrary, as soon as we can go on the offensive, appropriate orders will be given. In an effort to reduce our losses, which under the circumstances were too great in comparison with the very small results achieved, we had at the same time to utilize the reaction of the masses to the German repression in the interests of strengthening national solidarity and uniting the forces of the French people. On October 25, the day after the execution of 50 hostages at Nantes and Chateaubriand and 50 patriots at Bordeaux, I stated the following on the radio. By shooting our people, the enemy hoped to intimidate France. France will prove that she cannot be intimidated. I call on all Frenchmen and all Frenchwomen to stop all work and all movement where they will be on Friday, October 31, from 4 o'clock to 4:05 a.m., so that this serious warning, this powerful national strike, will demonstrate the strength of the fraternal solidarity of the French and show the enemy what danger awaits him everywhere. On the eve of the scheduled day, I repeated my appeal. The strike which had taken place had assumed in many places, especially in the factories, an impressive character. As a result, I became determined not to allow the resistance movement to degenerate into anarchy. On the contrary, I wanted to achieve organization without at the same time cutting off the initiative which was its driving force, and without rejecting the mutual isolation of the local organizations, without which the resistance could be completely eliminated at a single blow. At any rate, the members of the resistance movement and its organizations in many respects now acted with great determination, but they were sorely lacking in military specialists. There they could and should have found them. That is, in what was left of the army, the way was blocked by the Vichyists, and yet the first blows against the enemy were struck by the military. Army and district staff officers hid their weapons from the armistice commissions. The intelligence service continued to conduct counterintelligence in secret and occasionally sent information to the British, with the assistance of Generals Fréris, de Lestrade, Venot, Bloch-Dassault, Dermeyer, with the help, in particular, of officers' clubs. Mobilization measures were being prepared. General Cochet became active in propaganda against surrenderist sentiment. Among the leaders of youth organizations, which included a significant number of ex-military men, many trained themselves and taught others to wield weapons. In the remaining military units, almost all officers, non-commissioned officers, and soldiers did not hide their hopes to take part in the fighting again. The population was very positive about it. A newsreel brought from France, which I watched in London, served as clear proof of this. In the movie was filmed the moment when Pétain, during one of his trips to Marseilles, appeared on the balcony of the town hall in front of the troops and the people, who expressed their fervent patriotic feelings. One could hear how, obeying the unanimous mood of this mass of people, he shouted, "Do not forget that you are all mobilized." These words aroused the tumultuous enthusiasm of all assembled, military and non-military, who laughed and cried with excitement. Thus, even though the army had lost most of its often best soldiers and officers killed or captured, it spontaneously sought to lead a national resistance. However, this was precisely what the government to which the army was subordinate did not want. The Vichy regime, which at first maintained a semblance of neutrality, then embarked on a path of cooperation with the enemy, prevented the army from realizing its vocation, and as a result it found itself morally in a deadlock, the only way out of which could only be found by abandoning formal discipline. Although many military men did do so, especially those who were members of resistance organizations or who joined the secret army, or finally those who later founded the Army Resistance Organization. In fact, the resistance movement had to train its own cadres for the first time. In the Free Zone, organizations such as Combat, led by Captain Frenet, Liberation, in which Emmanuel Dastier de la Vigiere played a major role, and Frontiera, led by Jean-Pierre Lévy, engaged in active propaganda and created paramilitary formations. At the same time, the remnants of the former trade union organizations, the General Confederation of Labour and the French Confederation of Christian Workers, carried out propaganda in favour of the resistance. Similar work was carried out by various groups composed of members of former parties, such as the Socialist Party, the People's Democrats, and the Republican Federation. Since the zone was not occupied by the Germans, the struggle was naturally waged against the Vichy regime, against its police and tribunals. At the same time, the leaders, preparing forces that could be used against the enemy if necessary, thought of seizing power and saw in the resistance not only a tool of war, but also a means for regime change. The political character of the resistance organizations of the southern zone naturally made their activities very effective, helped to attract influential elements to their ranks, gave their propaganda a topicality and incendiary nature that awakened much. But on the other hand, the complete harmony and the consequent joint activity of the steering committees suffered from all this. It must be said that the rank-and-file members of these organizations and sympathizers were hardly interested in the further program of the resistance, nor in the conditions of the seizure of power, nor in the selection of future rulers. The general consensus was that the main thing was to fight, or at least to prepare for it. Getting weapons, setting up catches, preparing and occasionally carrying out raids. That was what it was all about. To this end, it was necessary to organize groups on the ground from people who knew each other, to find means to fight and to keep one's mouth shut. In short, if there was a relative unity of views within the organizations, the practical struggle was conducted, on the contrary, by disparate groups, which had their own leaders, acted independently and disputed each other's right to the weapons and money available in small quantities. In the occupied zone, under conditions of immediate danger, no such competition existed, but the fragmentation of people and efforts was much more pronounced there. There was a direct and dangerous neighborhood with the enemy. One had to deal with the Gestapo. There was no way to move around, to correspond, to choose an apartment without being subjected to strict control. Anyone suspicious was imprisoned and expelled. As for the active resistance, its fighters were inexorably subjected to torture and death. Under these conditions, the forces were extremely dispersed. At the same time, the presence of the Germans created an environment that encouraged resistance and the creation of underground organizations. This is why the resistance movement in this zone took on a tense military conspiratorial character. Civil and military organization founded by Colonel Tunney. The supporters of Liberation Organization led by Ripoffet. The supporters of Resistance Organization founded by Lecomte Boignet. The Liberal Organization formed by Cavaliers. Finally, the Voice of the North, founded in Hainaut in Flanders in the land of the miners, under the leadership of UK, categorically refused to adhere to any political direction, waged only armed struggle and operated in small, isolated underground groups. At the end of 1941, the Communists in turn joined the struggle. Until then, their leaders had taken a conciliatory stance towards the occupiers, but sharply attacked Anglo-Saxon capitalism and its servants, the Die Hollers. However, their behavior changed instantly when Hitler attacked Russia, and they themselves hardly managed to go underground and establish the connections necessary for the struggle. They were prepared for it, however, by their system of party cells, the secrecy of their hierarchy, and the loyalty of their cadres. They entered the national war with courage and skill, responding unquestionably to the call of the fatherland, but never losing sight, like the army of the revolution, of the ultimate goal, which was to establish their dictatorship, taking advantage of the drama that France was experiencing. They were at all times anxious to retain their freedom of action, but at the same time taking advantage of the sentiments of the resistance fighters, including those in their own ranks, who wanted only to fight. They strove hard to unite the entire resistance in order to turn it, if possible, into an instrument of their ambitious aspirations. Thus, in the occupied zone, they created the National Front, a grouping of a purely patriotic character, and the organization of the Frontiers at Partisans, which seemed to be intended exclusively to fight the Germans. In these organizations, they recruited numerous non-communist elements to disguise their designs. They sent their men under various guises into the governing bodies of all the other organizations. They soon offered me their assistance, while at the same time never for a moment ceasing to speak ill of the Degeleft myth. As far as I was concerned, I only wanted them to be useful. No force can be neglected in the fight against the enemy, and I believed that their participation would be a significant contribution to the peculiar war that was being waged under occupation, but it had to be ensured that they acted as part of a single organization, and let me be clear, relying largely on the powerful force of national feeling and the distrust which the masses had shown me. I decided at once to give them their due place in the French resistance and even, when the time came, in its leadership. However, I was equally determined not to allow them to dominate, to push me aside and to find themselves at the head of the leadership. The tragedy that was deciding the fate of France gave these Frenchmen, who had been excluded from the nation by the injustice that outraged them and led astray by their mistakes, a historic opportunity to become part of a united nation again, if only for a period of... I wanted to make sure that this opportunity was not lost forever. And then, as in the past, with the words "Vive la France," all those who in one way or another gave their lives for it could die. In the continuous movement of life, all doctrines, all schools, all revolutions are transient. Communism is not eternal, but France is eternal. I am sure that in the end a great part in her destiny will be played by the fact that under all circumstances at the time of liberation, in this short but decisive period of her history, she will be a united nation. In October 1941, I learned that Jean Moulin had arrived in Lisbon from France and wanted to go to London. I knew who this man was. I knew, in particular, that as prefect of the Department of Air Artillerie, he had shown great courage and dignity during the Germans' entry into Chartres. The Germans insulted him in every possible way, wounded him and threw him into prison. He was eventually released and apologized to. The Vichyists removed him from his post, and he was in disgrace. I knew he wanted to serve. So I asked the British authorities to send this worthy man to England. However, I had to wait for 2 months to get their consent. The intelligence service was anxious to take Moulin with them, but he, on the contrary, demanded to be sent to my disposal. Thanks to the urgent request which I made in writing to Eden, this honest Frenchman was able to arrive at his destination. Subsequently, it cost me the same effort to secure his return to France. During the month of December, I had long conversations with him. Jean Moulin had had numerous meetings with representatives of all the resistance organizations before he went to London, and had also probed the ground in various political, economic, and administrative. He was well aware of the situation in the places where L had intended to use him from the very beginning. He made clear proposals and clearly stated his requests. This man, who was still young but had already accumulated service experience, was of the same temperament as all my best associates. He loved France with all his soul, convinced that delegation should be not only an instrument of struggle, but also the driving force of all renewal. Convinced that the embodiment of the state was free France, he was eager to do great things. Besides, being a man of sound judgment, soberly assessing things and people, he very deliberately followed a path strewn with the traps of the enemy and the obstacles which his friends had created. Believing in his cause, calculating, not doubting anything and trusting nothing, an apostle and a doer at the same time, Moulin accomplished in 18 months the most important task. Unity in the resistance movement, which existed, in fact, symbolically, he turned into real unity. Then, victim of betrayal, imprisoned and brutally tortured by a vile enemy, Jean Moulin gave his life for France, like so many other brave soldiers who, in full view of everyone, or in hiding, devoted long nights to the struggle to make the dawn come sooner. We agreed that he would first try to work in the resistance organizations of the southern zone, to persuade them to set up a general body under his leadership, which would be directly linked to the National Committee, give general instructions and deal with internal disputes. Once this work was completed, Moulin was to take over the northern zone to try to organize a unified resistance council for the whole territory, linked to fighting France. But as soon as there was talk of creating a single body to lead all the organizations involved in the resistance movement in the metropolis, two questions arose: political parties and the internal armed forces in the country. In view of the representative, but by no means directive, character which I wished to give to this council, I did not think of excluding the parties. Their inclusion in the council was inevitable. In my opinion, however, our misfortunes were not due to the existence of the parties, but to the fact that, taking advantage of our dilapidated state institutions, they were illegally appropriating power for themselves. That is why, while I recognized the role of the parties, I did not want them to be at the head of the resistance now. In no way were their ideas or their activities the source of the resistance, because all these parties, without exception, had failed at the decisive moment. But yesterday they had been in crisis as a result of the catastrophe, but now they were beginning to strengthen. Their individual elements, joining the resistance movement, grouped themselves together within the framework of their previous relations. It is true that having lost their clientele, the object of their concern, as well as the opportunity to engage in combinations and bargain over portfolios, they thought and gave reason to think that they were returning to the pure roots of their existence, that to the ideals of social justice, the cult of national tradition, the preaching of the secular character of the state, and fervent Christian sentiments. Their respective organizations, thoroughly purified, seemed to want only one thing: to contribute immediately to the struggle by exploiting one or another tendency of public opinion. Meanwhile, the latter was beginning to appreciate the skillful actions of these familiar organizations, especially as they repudiated their previous mistakes. Finally, the behavior of the party figures was closely watched by the Allies. In pursuing the unity of the nation, facts had to be reckoned with. I therefore instructed Moulin to introduce, at the proper moment, party delegates, along with representatives of the various resistance organizations, into the council which was to be established. If I hoped in this way to achieve some unity in the political struggle of France, I wished to achieve the same in the armed struggle. In this respect, the first difficulty arose from the resistance organizations themselves, who, by creating fighting units, wanted to retain their power over them. Moreover, with the exception of a few mountainous or inaccessible areas, these units could only exist in the form of small groups. This was particularly the case in the Maquis, where guerrilla groups were formed mainly from people who had evaded being sent to Germany and who had to hide in the countryside. They could therefore only be expected to engage in guerrilla warfare, which would produce very effective results if their disparate actions became part of an overall concerted struggle. Thus, while allowing the various groups to act autonomously, the problem had to be solved by linking them together by means of a flexible but effective organization reporting directly to me. This would make it possible to outline for them, in the form of a plan agreed with the Allied command, common tasks, which they would carry out depending on the situation and, in particular, when the landing of Allied troops in Europe will finally be realized. I instructed Moulin to obtain from the resistance organizations this elementary interaction of their military groups. I had to wait several months, however, before I was able to establish a secret army command in the person of General de Lestrade. Jean Moulin was dropped by parachute in the south of France on the night of the 1st of January. He had my instructions appointing him as my delegate in the unoccupied zone of the metropolis with the task of ensuring the unity of action of the various groups of the resistance. His powers, therefore, could not in principle be challenged, but he was to exercise them with my support. It was therefore decided that he would be the central link in France of our communications. first of all with the southern zone and, if possible, with the northern zone, that he would have the means of communication at his disposal, that our liaison officers would be attached to him, that he would be aware of the movement of our personnel, goods and correspondence from England to France and back. Finally, that he would receive and distribute the money we sent for the various organizations operating in the metropolis. With these credentials, Moulin set to work. On his initiative, supported from below, the leaders of the resistance organizations of the southern zone soon worked together to set up a kind of council, with a representative of the National Committee as chairman. In March, they issued a joint declaration entitled One Struggle, one leader pledging themselves to unity of action and declaring that they were fighting under the leadership of General de Gaulle. Order began to prevail in the activities of the various organizations. A unification of activities was being prepared with regard to the paramilitarization of the guerrilla groups. At the same time, with our help, Moulins created centralized bodies under his delegation. For example, the Air and Sea Operations Service received instructions directly from Colonel de Vavren regarding the arrival and departure of planes and ships. Every month on moonlit nights, Lysan airplanes or bombers, led by pilots such as Laurent and Livery Level, who were masterful in these daring operations, landed at the designated points. The men who constantly risked their lives provided signaling, passenger and cargo pick-up or drop-off, and security. It was often necessary to receive containers that were dropped by parachute at designated locations to hide and distribute the cargoes they contained. Radio service, which Juliet had organized on the spot, also operated under Moulin's direction, transmitting to London and receiving from there monthly hundreds, and then thousands of telegrams, continually changing the location of their radio stations, detected by the enemy, and replenishing as far as possible their heavy losses. Moulins also created a Bureau of Press and Information headed by Georges Bidault, who kept us informed of the various moods, particularly of the intelligentsia, as well as of social and political circles. The General Research Committee established under him, in which Bastide, Lacoste, de Mountain, Parodi, Tetchen, Courtenay and Debret worked, drew up projects for the future. Bloch-Lenny managed, on behalf of the delegation, the financial operations and kept the money received from London. Thus, through Moulin, who held the main threads of leadership in his hands, the activities of our government began to produce practical results. This was confirmed in the first months of 1942 by eyewitnesses coming from France. Me was among them. One February night, he brought from Paris bundles of documents for our services, and my wife, azalea in a flower pot, bought on the Rue Royale. The activities of his Confrérie Notre Dame network were in full swing. For example, no German surface ship could go to Brest, Lorient, Nantes, Rochefort, La Rochelle, Bordeaux, or get out of there without London being informed of it by telegram. No enemy installation could be built on the Channel coast or on the Atlantic coast, particularly submarine bases, without its location and plan becoming immediately known to us. In addition, Remy methodically established links either with other networks or with the resistance organizations of the occupied zone or with the communists. The latter, having met him shortly before his departure, instructed him to tell me that they were prepared to recognize my leadership and to send a plenipotentiary representative to London at my disposal. In March, one of the leaders of the Organisation Liberation of the North and a confidant of the trade unions, Pinault, came to London for 3 months and did very useful work with us. In April, Emmanuel Dastier visited us, armed with various projects and calculations, and I thought it necessary to send him before returning to France to the United States to clarify some of the questions connected with the resistance there. Then Brossolette arrived. He was full of all the highest political ideas, deeply sorrowful for the fate of France, plunged into disaster, awaiting liberation only from the de-Gaullism which he had erected into a doctrine. Subsequently, he was one of the inspirers of our resistance in the country. But one day, while carrying out an assigned task, Brossolette was captured by the enemy and committed suicide, without hope for his own strength. With messages from some parliamentary figures also came Roch, who was subsequently arrested and killed. From the occupied zone came Paul Simon, sent by the civil and military organization to establish communication. Simon, with his hot mind and cold determination, rendered great services to the resistance. He was killed by the enemy on the eve of liberation. Finally, Philip Charles Vallin, Vienneau, Daniel Meyer, and others expressed a desire to come to London. My conversations with these men, mostly young, ardent, persistent in their struggle, and in their aspirations, showed me to what extent the regime that existed in the country at the time of the catastrophe had been discredited in the eyes of the French. The resistance movement was not only an outbreak of our extremely weakened defences, it was also the hope of renewal. Unless the resistance dissipated after victory, it was hoped that it would become a lever for profound transformation of the entire system and the broad effort of the nation. When I met the leaders of the resistance who had responded to my call, I thought that perhaps those of them who survived would form around me a leading nucleus for great accomplishments in the name of universal and French principles. But this would only be realistic if, when the danger had passed, they would submit to that discipline of mind and feeling without which nothing can be done, and which had united them this time. At any rate, the moment had come when I had to proclaim, with the consent of the whole resistance and in my own name, the goal to which we were aspiring. This goal was liberation in the full sense of the word, that is, the liberation of both the individual and the homeland. I proclaimed it in the form of a manifesto adopted by the National Committee after the resistance organizations and my representatives in France had expressed their opinions on it. In the manifesto, I declared that, determined to defend the liberty, honor, and security of France in the world by destroying the enemy, we intended to guarantee them to every Frenchman and every Frenchwoman by replacing the unworthy regime under which many citizens had been deprived of them. Thus, I denounced both the moral, social, political, and economic regime which fell in defeat and the regime resulting from criminal surrender. And I asserted, uniting for victory, the French people unite for revolution. The manifesto was published on June 23, 1942, in all the underground newspapers of both zones and broadcast by radio from Brazzaville, Beirut, and London. During this period of time, it was mainly the conditions of the struggle in the metropolis that forced me to leave the National Committee in London. However, I often thought of transferring its activities to French territory, for example, to Brazzaville. This question arose especially when there was a crisis in our relations with England. But in such cases, I answered myself, how can I contact my homeland from deep in Africa, talk to it, and lead the resistance? Britain, on the contrary, has all the necessary means of communication and information. In addition, our efforts at diplomatic relations with the Allied governments required appropriate contacts, surroundings which were available in the British capital and which we would certainly have been deprived of on the shores of the Congo. Finally, I must be in constant touch with those of our units, which could only be stationed in the British Isles. On my return from the East, therefore, I established my residence in London. There I remained for 10 months. I recall now my life of that period. It is not difficult to believe that it was a busy one. To make a long story short, I lodged at the Connaught Hotel. I also rented, first in Ellesmere, then in Berkhamsted near the capital, a cottage in which I spent every Saturday and Sunday with my wife and daughter Anna. Later we moved to the Hampstead neighbourhood of London. Philip sailed and fought in the Atlantic Ocean aboard the corvette Rosalys and then in the English Channel as assistant commander of the torpedo boat 96 after enrolling in naval school. Elizabeth, living in the boarding house Dame de Sion, prepares for classes at Oxford. Everywhere the population is tactfully expressing their sympathies to us. Every official appearance I make is greeted with enthusiasm. The English show polite courtesy when they see me with my family in the street, at the movies, or on a walk in the park. In this way, I learn from experience that every member of this great nation respects the freedom of others. Most often my day is spent at Carlton Gardens. There I hear reports, receive letters and telegrams from François Coulais, who became Chief of Cabinet after Corsill went to Libya to command a detachment of armoured cars, and from Billiat, my Chief of Staff, who has succeeded 2 persons, Petit, who has been sent to Moscow, and Ortoli, who commands the counter-bearer Triomphant. Their Sustal reports to me on the information received during the day. Passy de Wavren brings reports received from France. Schumann receives from me instructions regarding his performances on the radio. There I settle business matters. With the national commissioners and chiefs of services, receive visitors or invitees, give orders and instructions, and sign decrees. Often I have breakfast and sometimes lunch in the company of Allied representatives or Frenchmen with whom I have to converse. As for the great work of editing my speeches, I do it at home in the evenings or on Sunday. At any rate, I try not to interfere with the services by uncalculated time allocation. As a rule, no one at Carlton Gardens, with the exception of the Cipher Bureau, works at night. However, I was still to make numerous visits. independently of conversations with English ministers, staff meetings, ceremonies to which I am invited by the British or other allied governments, I go on occasion to one of the centres of French life in London, the French Institute, which immediately joined our cause in the person of its director, Professor Saw, affords our countrymen valuable opportunities for study and active spiritual life. The French Association continues its work under the direction of Témoin and Salmon, Maison de l'Institut de France, right up to the evening when it was destroyed by bombs, burying its administrator, Robert Cruy, under the rubble, delivers from its library the documentation needed by our services. Friends of the French Volunteers, a society directed by Lord Tyrrell, Lord de War, Lord Ivor Churchill, and composed chiefly of Englishmen, and the Coordination Committee of Fighting France in Scotland, under the chairmanship of our friend Lord Inverclyde, render able and generous assistance to the French fighters. The French Chamber of Commerce mediates the exchange of goods between Great Britain and the territories which have joined Free France. The Free France Reception Centre takes into its care all arrivals from the mother country. The French hospital treats many of our wounded. By participating in all these organisations, I seek to strengthen in England, as everywhere else, our national solidarity. The Association of French in Great Britain gives me active assistance. It is the one that organises several mass rallies involving civilians and military personnel. For me, provide an opportunity for me to meet the French, for those present to express their convictions, and for the metropolis to hear our speeches on the radio and to feel the mood in the room. Already on March 1, 1941, in Kingsway Hall before an audience of thousands, I defined our task and firmly expressed our hopes. On November 15, in the vast hall of the Albert Hall, filled to overflowing with the audience, I solemnly proclaimed the three main points of our policy. The meaning of the first clause, I said, is to make war, that is, to give as much scope and as much power as possible to the French efforts in the conflict. But these efforts we make only at the call of France and in her interest. Then, strongly condemning both the pre-war regime and the Vichy regime, I said, we consider it necessary that a mighty and healing wave should rise from the depths of the nation and wash away the causes of the catastrophe together with all the superstructure that has arisen over the capitulation. The second clause of our policy, therefore, requires that the people be given law as soon as events permit them to express freely what they want and what they do not want. Finally, in the third clause, I outlined the foundations on which we believe the renewed institutions of France should be built. These foundations, I said, are defined by the three mottos of the Free French. We say honour and homeland, meaning that a nation can only be revived by victory, that it can only exist as a great nation. We say liberty, equality and fraternity because we want to remain true to democratic principles. We say liberation, for if our efforts are not weakened before the enemy is defeated, their consummation must be the creation for every Frenchman of such conditions that he can live and labour in peace and dignity. Then those present, seized with deep excitement, exuberantly express their feelings of enthusiasm, and the explosion of enthusiasm spreads far beyond the Albert Hall. Such gatherings are rare. In making inspections, I often visit our volunteers. Our forces, land, sea, and air, though very small and scattered, composed by us of scattered units, are now a united whole and are growing stronger every day. The organisational plan, which I gave to the military, naval and air commissars for 1942, is being exactly carried out. I am convinced of this when I visit units stationed in England, when the soldiers, seeing at close quarters the one they call Big Charles, by their looks, their behaviour, the ardour with which they are trained, express to him their sincere affection. Of all our small army that fights in Africa and the East, there are only training centres on English soil, but in them the greater part of our cadres are trained. At Camp Camberley, Colonel Renoir introduces me to a battalion of gamekeepers, an artillery division, an artillery squadron, a tank squadron, a detachment of engineers, a communications unit, which produce every 6 months sergeants and specialists. I pass into the artillery park, where, under the command of Major Boutet, French equipment brought earlier to Britain by the rear services of the Norwegian expedition or by warships that arrived from France during the enemy invasion is being put in order. Weapons, ammunition and vehicles are used to equip the new formations, along with the equipment supplied by the British in accordance with the agreement of August 7, 1940, and the Americans under the Lend-Lease. Negotiations and practical fulfillment of this important task is handled by the Armament Service under the leadership of Colonel Morn. During an airplane accident in the line of duty, this fine officer dies and his post is taken over by Major Harish. In London itself, I sometimes visit a company of French women volunteers, led by Mademoiselle Terra, and then Mrs. Mathieu, where decent, patriotic girls are trained as drivers, nurses, secretaries. From time to time I visit the cadets of Free France at Malvern, and then at Rye-Bresford. In 1940 I set up this school for students and pupils who had moved to England. We soon turned it into an officers' school commanded by Major Baudouin. Its 5 graduating classes have produced 211 platoon commanders, of whom 52 have fallen fighting the enemy. Nothing encourages the head of the Free French more than contact with these young people, the hope of reviving the faded glory of France. While units of ground troops stationed in Great Britain are being trained to then fight on various fronts, our naval forces, mostly based in British desks, are engaged in the battle of communications in the Atlantic, the English Channel, the North Sea, and the Arctic, and to do this we must utilize Allied bases. Indeed, we do not have the necessary materials to repair, maintain, and supply our ships. Moreover, we cannot supply them with new means. Air defense, sonar, radar, etc., the use of which requires the development of military technology. Finally, in the vast theatre of naval operations, the centre of which is England, technical and tactical unity of effort is necessary. This is why, although the ships we arm are at our complete disposal, regardless of their origin, although they all fly the tricolour flag, although the officers and crews are subject only to French regulations, although they follow the orders of their chiefs only, although our navy remains purely national, yet with few exceptions, when we use it directly, it takes part mainly in the general hostilities conducted by the English. This, however, is to its advantage, for it is incorporated into a system exceptional in combatability, discipline, and activity. For their part, the British, appreciating at face value our assistance, provide the French Navy extensive material support. Their arsenals and services do everything possible to tidy up and supply our ships. Despite the difference in type and armament, the new materials used by the English Navy are immediately supplied to our Navy as well. New ships, corvettes and boats, later frigates, destroyers, submarines, transferred to us directly from the shipyards. If our small fleet has been able to play its part and maintain the honour of French arms on the seas, it owes it both to the help of the Allies and to the merits of our sailors. I am convinced of this every time I visit the fleet units at Greenock, Portsmouth, Cowes, and Dartmouth. Considering the nature of the fight and the small number of our sailors, we arm only small vessels, but these Free France ships are doing their best with honour. First of all, we armed, of course, the ships that came from France. By the spring of 1942, of our 5 first submarines remained Ryubi, Minervie, Junon, which in Norwegian, Danish, and French waters attacking enemy ships, put mines, landing troops. Naval disappeared off Malta in December 1940. Surcouf was sunk in February 1942. Rear destroyers Triomphant, Leonard, destroyers Melpomene and Bouclier for several months escorted caravans in the Atlantic Ocean and the English Channel. Then Triomphant was sent to the Pacific. Leopard arrived in South Africa. Later it carried out communication with the island of Reunion and finally shipwrecked near Tobruk. The Melpomene passed into the North Sea. Bouclier became one of our training ships. Of our 5 messenger ships, 3, Savonian de Brazza, Commando Duboc, Commando Domine, are cruising off the coast of Africa. Moquez helps guard communications in the Irish Sea. Chevreuse patrols in Oceania near Nouméa, and joins May 27, 1942 to the Free France islands of Wallis and Futien. 2 minesweepers, Congre and Lucien Jane, perform their arduous duties on the approaches to English ports. 10 sea hunters took part in covering the Allied transports between Cornwall and the Pass de Calais. There were now only 8, as 2 of them had been sunk. Patrol vessels were put into service. Pomic sunk off Plymouth in November 1940. Viking lost on the high seas off Tripolitania in November 1942. Vaillant, Président Ondas, Reine de Flot, which continues to plough the seas. Leonile, used as a floating base for the merchant fleet. The auxiliary cruiser Cap de Palms shuttles between Sydney and Nouméa. 4 floating bases, the Hurricane, Amiens, Aras, and Diligent, complete the sea part of the port of Greenock and the Bir Hakeim crew base of Portsmouth, where our seamen are trained. The old battleship corvette serves as a training centre for recruits, workshops, ammunition and food depot. Anchored in the Portsmouth roadstead, she supports the defence of this major port with her artillery. Our small fleet also includes ships obtained from the British. These are primarily corvettes, built after the outbreak of war to cover caravans. These corvettes continuously guard the communications between England, Iceland, Newfoundland, and Canada. Lost in action in March 1942. Mimosa, which sank 3 months later with the commander of the light motorized division on board, Captain Second Rank Biro Aconite, Lobelia, Roslis, Renoncourt, Commandant d'Etienne d'Orve, Commandant Dragou, Commandant Detroit. Among the vessels we have also received are 8 torpedo boats of the 28th Flotilla, furrowing the channel at high speed and attacking enemy transports and escort ships that prowl the coast of France at night. We have also been given 8 motorboats, forming the 20th Flotilla, which operates in the channel in conjunction with our hunters of French design. We are, however, preparing to arm entirely new vessels. Many of the frigates which are beginning to come out of the English arsenals are placed at our disposal by the Allies as soon as they are launched. We have taken 4 of them: Découverte, Adventurous, Surprise, and Croix de Lorraine, the destroyer Combatant. The submarines Curie and Doris, which are being completed, are also left behind us. We would like to acquire other ships that would increase the number of enemy submarines, transports, patrol vessels we have sunk, and the number of aircraft we have shot down. But our role and scope of action is limited not by the lack of ships, but by the lack of personnel. Already by June 1942, 700 sailors free France died for their homeland. Our naval forces number 3,600 sailors. To them we must also include a battalion of riflemen under the command of Amiot Denville, who replaced Detroit, who died on the battlefield. To this must also be added a number of naval pilots, who, unable to form a separate unit, serve in the aviation. Finally, this includes the landing disceremonial units, which are being trained in Great Britain under the command of Lieutenant Commander Kiefer. In May I came to an agreement with British Admiral Lord Mountbatten, the British Admiral in charge of combined operations, on the terms of use of these eager troops. They soon took part in daring raids on the French coast. Our personnel was staffed by half of the sailors who were in England in 1940. In Gabon, in the Middle East, some joined us after fighting against us. This was the case with the crews of the submarine Ajax, sunk off Dakar, the submarine Puncelet, sunk by her commander off Port Gentil, the messenger ship Bougainville, which we had to put out of action in the Libreville raid. From time to time we are joined by individual cadre sailors coming from France, North Africa, Alexandria, the Antilles, and the Far East. The Navy recruits the maximum number of young Frenchmen from among those stationed in England, America, the Levant, Egypt, and the island of Saint-Pierre. Finally, merchant ships provide the Navy with most of its personnel. The most difficult task for the Naval Commissariat is the replenishment of ships with commanding officers. It has to be recruited from a wide variety of people, often untrained without regard to their specialty. We do not have enough regular officers. We make up for their shortage by training young people. Under the leadership of Captains Second Rank Witzel and Guirel, who successively commanded the school department, the Maritime School of Free France is actively working on board the President Theodore Tissier and the schooners Etoile and Belle Poule. For 4 graduates she gave 80 candidates for officer rank. All their abilities have been given to the French Navy by these men, hardened from the beginning by sorrow, battles, and hopes. On the other hand, we make extensive use in our Navy of a cadre of reserve officers taken from merchant ships and from among the personnel of the Suez Canal. The 200 candidates thus recruited will serve on watch aboard frigates, corvettes, gunboats, and minesweepers for a total of more than 1 million hours. Notwithstanding these reductions in personnel, the portion of the French merchant navy in the Allied camp is of considerable assistance to them. Of the 660 passenger and merchant ships of 2 million, 700,000 tons displacement which belonged to France at the beginning of the war, 170 ships of 700,000 tons displacement will still be engaged in hostilities after the armistice. Our merchant marine service, under the leadership of Mulglove and Benjane, and later Smyers and Andius Ferries, manned a large number of vessels with French crews. In addition, this service is involved in the management of our ships in the possession of the British. In this case, next to the English national flag on the stern or on the mast of the ship's exiles flies a tricolor flag. During this period, we were equipped with 67 merchant ships of 200,000 tons displacement. 20 of them we lost. By the spring of 1942, out of the total number of 580 officers and 4,300 sailors of the merchant fleet, more than a quarter died at sea. Passenger ships are engaged in the transportation of troops. Thus, Ile-de-France, Felix Roussel, President Paul Doumer deliver to the East British reinforcements from Australia and India. Transport ships carrying raw materials, arms and ammunition usually sail in caravans. Occasionally, some of them have to cross the ocean alone. These ships never stay long in port, where they are often bombarded. In the high seas, the service is tedious and dangerous. You have to be on the alert day and night, strictly follow instructions, constantly occupy their posts on the alert. Often have to participate in battles, shoot guns, maneuver lightning fast to avoid torpedoes or bombs. It happens that the ship is submerged in water, and you find yourself in cold, oil-stained water, while your comrades are drowning nearby. It also happens that you feel great joy to be present at the fall of an enemy bomber or to see a smear of fuel oil, a sign of a sinking enemy submarine. Sometimes you are the cause of it, as it was with a simple cargo ship Fort Bange, which in May 1942 in the open sea off Newfoundland sank a German submarine. One day in Liverpool, Admiral Sir Percy Noble, commander of ship movements and operations in the entire Atlantic Theatre, invited me to his command post, located in a concrete underground shelter. On large nautical charts hung on the walls, indicated the ever-changing location of all Allied caravans, all warships, all aircraft performing combat missions, as well as established or suspected positions of German submarines, aircraft, raiders. The central telephone exchange, connected with outside lines with radio stations, cipher bureaus, and served by an unperturbed female staff. Telephonists, stenographers, dispatchers, almost silently transmits orders, instructions, messages of the command to distant naval addressees and, as they are received, the answers of the latter. Everything is recorded on luminous tables. In this way, the greatest battle of communications appears in all its vicissitudes. Having considered the whole, I turn my eyes to the maps where our forces are indicated. I see them in their proper places, that is, where they are most worthy of reward. The greetings of the head of Free France are broadcast to them, but then, realizing how numerically small they are compared to the foreign forces they are part of, remembering that there, at Toulon, Casablanca, Alexandria, Fort-de-France, Dakar, French ships are idle, realizing what a historic opportunity this war presents to the maritime vocation of France, I feel sadness overwhelm me, and I leave the underground shelter with a heavy heart. A similar feeling is added to my pride when I meet our airmen at this or that English base, seeing all their virtues and, on the other hand, thinking of all that French aviation could do from bases in our North Africa, the Middle East or England. If given the chance to fight, I feel that a great national treasure is being wasted. But this makes me work even harder to ensure that the efforts of those who could join me are credited to France. If I have understandably ordered that our pilots flying from English bases in English airplanes should be part of the English air system, I have nevertheless endeavoured also to ensure that our pilots should constitute a unified national whole. This was not easy to accomplish. At first, our allies did not care at all about the Free French Air Force. For practical reasons and lack of time, they accepted some of our pilots into their units. But the only thing they could offer us was to include our volunteers in the Royal Air Force. I could not agree to that. Thus, the position of our pilots remained for nearly a year uncertain. Some of them, integrated into French squadrons, could take part in air battles in Eritrea and Libya. Others, temporarily taken into English squadrons, participated in the Battle of Britain, but most, for lack of materiel, training languished in inactivity outside air bases in England and Egypt. But this problem, too, was in turn solved. In the spring of 1941, I was able to resolve matters of principle with the British Minister of Aviation, Sir Archibald Sinclair. A man of broad mind and nobility, he understood that the existence of the Free French Air Force was not without benefit. He agreed with my proposal to create our squadrons on the model of the British. The English would provide us with the missing ground staff and train our pilots in their schools. A surplus of our pilots could serve in English units. But they were to be in the position of seconded French officers, subject to French regulations and wearing French uniforms. On June 8, 1941, I wrote from Cairo to Sir Archibald confirming the agreement worked out on these bases by Colonel Valin. Since then, this agreement has been rigorously enforced by Air Marshals Portal in London, Longmore. At the end of 1941, we established in England a squadron of Ile-de-France fighters under Citivo. When he was shot down over France, from which, however, he returned, he was replaced by Duperrier. The day after the start of the campaign in Syria in Egypt was formed a squadron of fighters Alsace, which fought first in Libya under the command of Puligena, and then redeployed to England, where it was headed by Muchot, who died the next year in battle with the enemy. In the Levant is organised a squadron of bombers Lorraine under the command of Pigot. This last, shot down a few weeks later over enemy territory, managed to reach his own, and here he died. He is replaced by Cornin and Molyneux. To support our operations in the Sahara, in the area of Lake Chad organised a mixed squadron Brittany headed by Seya Perez. In the spring of 1942 gathered partly in London, partly in Ryak pilots who would later form a squadron in Russia, and then the regiment Normandy. This part was successively commanded by Toulaine, Litov, and after their deaths Payard. Finally, some of our pilots are placed by my order at the disposal of the Royal Air Force. Morlet, Gayol, Gedge are commanding squadrons there. The last two will be killed in action. Glory is expensive in air battles. Losses of Aviation Free France twice the number of active flying personnel. However, if the global nature of the war forced me to do so that the French forces took part in battles in all theatres of war, the main effort I tried to concentrate in North Africa, in the area in which the most interested in France. Having destroyed the Italian army in Ethiopia, blocking the Germans' road to Syria, nipped in the bud Vichy's attempt to oppose Free French Africa, we had to begin action in Libya. In November 1941, the British undertook another offensive here. If they succeeded in reaching the Tunisian border, it would be important for us to go there together with them, having first assisted them in fighting the enemy. If, on the contrary, the enemy succeeded in driving them back, we should do our best to help them stop the enemy before he broke into Egypt. In either case, we had to exert our best efforts, but save our own face in order to gain a victory useful to France. We could act in two ways. To launch an offensive from Lake Chad to Fezzan by the forces of the Saharan Column, long prepared by Leclerc, or to include in the British offensive in Libya mobile forces standing ready in the Levant under the command of Lahr. I decided to carry out both options, but in such a way that the actions of our soldiers will directly benefit France. The seizure of Fezzan and the subsequent march on Tripoli was an operation fraught with great risk. Had it failed, it could not have been resumed for a long time, owing to the unprecedented difficulty of forming, equipping and supplying a column in the Lake Chad. This column was to operate with all its forces only when the British, having retaken Cyrenaica, would have entered Tripolitania. Otherwise it was to confine itself to disturbing the Italians by making deep and rapid raids. On the other hand, I wanted the Chad front, if a number of by necessity disparate actions could be so called, to remain a French front. Certainly the start of our Saharan operation had to be coordinated with the movement of the British Eighth Army. This depended on communication with Cairo. But otherwise Leclerc would be subordinate only to me until the day when, having joined on the approaches to the Mediterranean with our allies, he would naturally have to come at their disposal. This autonomy was all the more dear to me, because the conquest of Fezzan would be in our hands, a pledge in the subsequent decision of the fate of Libya. During November and December the British, fighting fierce and heavy battles, penetrated into Cyrenaica. Awaiting their entry into Tripolitania, Leclerc, supported by General Serre, who was then commander-in-chief of the troops in Free French Africa, was preparing for an offensive on Fezzan. As for me, I was not optimistic in this matter. Knowing that Rommel was able to escape from the British clutches, and that after the withdrawal of Weygand from North Africa agreement Hitler-Darlan gave the enemy the opportunity to receive supplies from Tunisia, I did not count on the rapid advance of the Allies to Tripoli. On the contrary, it seemed to me more likely to counterattack the enemy. Therefore, while authorizing preparations for the offensive, I refrained from assigning a precise date for its commencement, since, on the other hand, a liaison mission which Leclerc sent to Cairo had been placed under such conditions that it was compelled to accept submission to the British command. I pointed out to General Ismay that I did not agree to this and explained to the representatives of the mission their role. Indeed, our allies did not enter Tripolitania. The first months of 1942 were a period of stabilization for both sides. From then on, our troops in the Lake Chad area could only make raids, and Leclerc was eager to get on with it. On February 4, I gave my consent. He did this during March, marching with his combat units, supported by airplanes, through the Fezzan, destroying many enemy posts and capturing numerous prisoners and trophies. It then returned to its base, suffering minor losses. In order to expand the scope and capability of this exceptionally capable military commander, I appointed him in April to command all the armed forces of Free French Africa, and this time I had to overcome the protests caused by his excessive modesty. From that time he himself and his troops felt themselves strong enough to seize the oasis as soon as events in Libya developed in a favourable direction. They had, however, to wait another long 10 months in terrible heat among rocks and sands before they were victorious and washed away at last in the Mediterranean Sea. But if in the Lake Chad region we had to delay the decisive blow, in Cyrenaica there was a long-awaited opportunity to show what we could do. However, we had to overcome many obstacles before we got the consent of the Allies to the participation of large French formations in the fighting in the area. Indeed, 2 light motorized divisions and a tank regiment formed in Syria under the command of Lamin was not taken into account by the British command in preparation for the offensive launched in late October. However, both formations were strong and well armed. Each was motorized and consisted of 5 infantry battalions, an artillery regiment, an ATGM company, an air defense company, an intelligence unit, an engineer company and fleet, a communications company, a transport company, a headquarters company. These formations, which included units from all branches of the military and were therefore capable of performing a separate tactical task, were divisions in the literal sense of the word. Although they were in fact light, it was the name I insisted on that was appropriate. La Mina, using weapons left by dens or captured in depots, guarded by the Italian armistice commissions, had furnished all the units with formidable armament, and our volunteers, energetic and industrious fellows, wielded them to perfection. Thus, in addition to the divisional artillery, each battalion had 6 75mm guns. There were also many mortars and automatic weapons. In the case of the offensive should have lightened the troops, but in defence they had exceptional firepower. Approved September 20 composition of 2 light motorized divisions, I sent a letter to Churchill on October 7, informing him of our intentions and capabilities. At the same time, I wrote to General Auchinleck, Commander-in-Chief of the forces in the East, reminding him of our desire to fight in Libya. I pointed out to Churchill and General Auchinleck that in carrying out these operations I was prepared to subordinate the entire Lamin force to British command, and that, on the other hand, Leclerc, although acting autonomously, would be able to undertake an offensive on Fezzan when necessary. On October 9, I visited the English Minister of War, Margison, and asked him to interfere in the matter. Finally, on October 30, I communicated to General Catros the conditions on which our troops should take part in the hostilities. The chief condition was that whole formations should be allowed to act. It was not until November 27 that I received the English reply. It was sent to me by General Ismay, Chief of Staff of Churchill's War Cabinet. His letter meant a refusal, polite but emphatic. To explain this refusal, our allies referred to the disunity of the French units located in various points in Syria, to the fact that they were not trained to act in divisions and brigades, finally to their inadequate equipment. They expressed the hope, however, that the future would permit a reconsideration of the matter. It was clear that the British command expected to complete the conquest of Libya and to finish Rommel without the help of the French. True, it had significant ground and air forces in the area, and believed that Admiral Andrew Cunningham, a fine commander and sailor, will be able to accomplish the impossible and completely cut off enemy communications between Italy and Tripolitania. One can imagine how disappointed I was with the English reply. I could not allow our troops to remain idle indefinitely when battles were deciding the fate of the world. I therefore preferred to take the risk of a change of orientation. I invited Bogomolov and asked him to inform his government that the National Committee wished the French armed forces to take a direct part in Allied operations on the Eastern Front in the event that the theatre of operations in North Africa was closed to them. It goes without saying that I made no secret of my proposal in London, but even before I received an answer from Moscow, the intentions of the British changed. On December 7, Churchill wrote me a fervent letter in which he indicated that he had just learned from General Auchinleck that this latter would very much like to involve the Free France Brigade in operations in Cyrenaica. I know, added the Prime Minister, that this intention is in accordance with your wish. I know also how eager your soldiers are to compete with the Germans. I replied to Churchill that I approve of the project and will give the necessary orders to General Catre. In fact, the British, in addition to the fact that they would be unpleasant possible movement of French forces in Russia, were beginning to realize what military benefit could bring our help in the battle for Cyrenaica. They became convinced with their own eyes that the enemy is stubbornly defending every scrap of land, that their own troops are suffering heavy losses, that they need to reorganize on the ground command, poorly adapted to operations involving mechanized troops. By refusing to continue the offensive in Tripolitania, they expected that Rommel would soon retake the initiative. This prospect forced them to seek our help. In Cairo, Catre agreed with Auchinleck to move to Libya 1st Light Motorized Division, and Koenig, in discussing the details of the agreement, achieved that the Allies provided us with assistance, providing anti-tank and anti-aircraft guns and vehicles. In January, this division fought several successful battles with Rommel's units surrounded at Sollum and Bardia, which soon capitulated. Seeing the string of German prisoners they had helped to capture, our troops were shaken to the core. In cheerful and uplifted spirits, they headed west. In February, while the British were placing their main forces in the centre of Cyrenaica, at the so-called Gazala position, consisting of several fortified areas, our troops occupied the Bir Hakeim area to the south, strengthening their positions. They at the same time conducted active reconnaissance searches deep in the no-man's land that separated them from the main enemy forces. But if the 1st Light Motorized Division was lucky, it was quite different with the 2nd, which continued to be inactive in the Levant. I wanted it to take part in the war effort as well. Just Udikaba, Bogomolov informed me that my project of sending French troops to Russia met with the enthusiastic approval of his government, which is ready to supply our forces on the spot with everything necessary. Then I decided to send to the east not only the Air Squadron Normandy, but also the 2nd Light Motorized Division. This latter, departing from Syria and passing through Baghdad, was to cross Iran by truck, then from Tabriz by rail to arrive in the Caucasus. This was the usual route by which cargoes sent by the Allies were brought to Russia from Iranian ports. On December 29, I wrote to General Ismay, warning him of my intentions, and gave General Catre the necessary instructions. On March 15, the 2nd Motormech Division was to go to the Caucasus. If it was not required in Libya before then, the British command raised all possible objections to the project of sending the division to Russia. In Moscow, however, the Soviets seized on the idea, motive in conversations with Garro, General Panfilov with Petit, hurried us to realize it. Eden, put on notice, spoke on his part and wrote to me, supporting the point of view of the British military. I continued to insist on my own, and at the end of February the Allied command made a favourable decision. I was informed of this by Ismay. Auchinleck asked Catre to put at his disposal the 2nd Light Motorized Division. Leaving Syria, it arrived in Libya in the last days of March. Koenig was now in place, Koenig with the 1st Division, on the line Bir Hakeim, Kazo with the 2nd, in reserve. The tank regiment under Colonel Remy was receiving new material in the rear. A company of paratroopers, which I transferred from England, was training at Ismailia, ready for a combat mission. This amounted to 12,000 soldiers and officers, or about half of the Allied forces operating in the area. The Alsace Fighter Squadron and the Lorraine Bomber Squadron had been fighting since October in the skies of Cyrenaica. Many of our messenger ships and minesweepers participated in escorting caravans along the coast. Thus, a substantial French force was concentrated in time for the main theatre of operations. Soon the god of war gave the soldiers of Free France the opportunity to participate in a great battle and cover themselves with unfading glory. On May 27, Rommel goes on the offensive. Bir Hakeim is attacked. In enterprises in which one risks everything, there usually comes a moment when the one who leads the game feels that fate is about to be decided. By a remarkable coincidence, the 1,000 trials to which he is exposed seem to be embodied unexpectedly in one decisive episode. If that episode is successful, fortune smiles. But if it confuses the leader, the whole affair is lost. At a time when the drama of Bir Hakeim is being played out around the 16-square-kilometre range held by Koenig's soldiers, I myself, being in London, reading the telegrams, listening to the comments, reading the looks of fear and hope. Calculate what will be the consequences of what is happening there. If these 5,500 fighters, each with his own grief and hope, who have come voluntarily from France, Africa, the Levant, the Pacific, assembled, despite so many difficulties, where they are now, are defeated, our cause will be seriously undermined. Conversely, if at this moment, on this soil, they accomplish a great feat, the future belongs to us. The first battles have been carried out as well as possible. I am informed that on May 27, when the main enemy forces passed south of Bir Hakeim to encircle the Allied positions, the Italian motorized division Ariete threw 100 tanks against the French and lost 40 of them, the wreckage of which dotted the battlefield. May 28 and 29, our detachments sent in all directions, destroyed another 15 tanks and captured 200 prisoners. May 30, General Rommel, who could not cope with the British mechanized formations in one blow, decides to withdraw to carry out a new maneuver. 2 days later, a French column under the command of Colonel Brock seizes the position Rotonda Signali, located 50 kilometers to the west. June 1, Lamina inspects our troops on the ground. His report is full of optimism. A certain opinion is created in the world. Some predict that this affair could far exceed the limits of a tactical operation. Radio and newspapers with restraint, choosing their expressions sparingly, begin to praise the French troops and their commanders. The next day, Rommel resumes the offensive. This time he attacks the centre of the position of General Vichy, appointed O'Kinley commander of the front. The Germans seize in Got El Scarab position of one British brigade, overcome at this point a large minefield covering the approaches to Gazala and Bir Hakeim, and in order to expand the breakthrough sent against our troops one division of the African Corps. For the first time since June 1940, the French and Germans again meet in a major battle. At first in small skirmishes we take 150 prisoners, but very soon the front is set for battle. To 2 enemy parliamentarians who suggest surrender, Koenig replies that this is not why he came here. Meanwhile, in the following din, the enemy tightens the encirclement ring. Batteries of heavy guns, including 155 and 200mm guns, are firing on our positions, which is becoming more and more intense. 3, 4, 5 times a day stormtroopers and Junkers raid 100 airplanes at a time. Food is not arriving in sufficient quantities. There is less and less ammunition left in Bir Hakeim. The food ration is reduced. The distribution of water is reduced. Under the scorching sun, amidst sand swirls, the defenders are in constant anxiety, living with the wounded, burying the dead beside themselves. On June 3, General Rommel sends a letter, written by his own hand, demanding that they lay down their arms. Otherwise they will be annihilated like the British brigades at Got El Scarab. On June 5, one of his officers repeats this proposal. He is answered by the fire of artillery. But at the same time, public interest is awakened in many countries in us. The French of Bir Hakeim are attracting increasing attention from the press and radio. Public opinion is preparing to make its judgment. The question is posed, can glory still overshadow our soldiers? On June 7, Bir Hakeim is completely surrounded. The German 90th Division and the Italian Trieste Division, supported by 24 batteries and hundreds of tanks, are ready to storm. Hold out for 6 more days. Ordered Koenig by Allied command on the evening of June 1. Those 6 days had expired. Hold out another 48 hours, General Vichy pleaded. It must be said that the crushing blows of the enemy, which have inflicted such losses on the 8th Army and caused such confusion, are such that any replacement or relief operation is now impossible. As for Rommel, anxious to reach Egypt more quickly, taking advantage of the confusion among the British, he is greatly annoyed by this French resistance, which continues in his rear and constricts his communications. Bir Hakeim becomes his chief concern and his main objective. He has already appeared at the position many times and will do so many more to hasten the action of the assaulting troops. On June 8, fierce attacks begin. The enemy infantry repeatedly, supported by large forces of artillery and tanks, persistently but unsuccessfully trying to seize one or another section of our positions. A very hard day for our troops and a hard night, during which our positions damaged by shelling are put in order. On June 9, the attacks are resumed. The enemy artillery has been reinforced with large-caliber guns, with which Colonel Laurent Champrosit's 75mm guns cannot fight. Our soldiers receive only about 2 liters of water a day. which in the local climate is quite insufficient. However, it is still necessary to hold on, because with the confusion gradually engulfing the various divisions of the British Army, the resistance of Koenig now assumes decisive importance. Heroic defence of the French. Brilliant feat. Germans defeated at Bir Hakeim. The news agencies of London, New York, Montreal, Cairo, Rio de Janeiro, Buenos Aires. We are approaching the goal we set out to accomplish by assigning to the Free French troops, so small in numbers, a large part in these great events. The cannons at Bir Hakeim have heralded to the world the beginning of the rebirth of France. But henceforth I am troubled by the thought of saving the defenders. I realize that they will not be able for a long time to repel an attack supported by powerful means. Of course, I am convinced that in any case the division will not surrender, that the enemy will be deprived of the pleasure of seeing a long column of French prisoners pass in front of Rommel, and that if our troops will stand firm, the enemy, to overcome them, will need to destroy them piecemeal. But it is a question of saving the troops, not of being reconciled to their heroic loss. By absolutely need for future operations, these hundreds of excellent officers and non-commissioned officers, these thousands of excellent soldiers, they can accomplish one feat. They must now accomplish another. To break through the ring of enemy troops, passing through minefields, and join the main Allied forces. Although I refrain from directly interfering in the direction of the battle, nevertheless, during June 8 and 9, I continue to address the English Imperial headquarters with great insistence, indicating that it is of the utmost importance that Koenig, before it is too late, be ordered to try to escape the encirclement. I repeat this on June 10 to Churchill, with whom I was then discussing the Madagascar question. Meanwhile, the denouement is approaching, and I telegraphed the commander of the 1st Light Motorized Division. General, know and tell your troops that all of France is looking at you and is proud of you. And at the end of the day, General Sir Alan Brooke, Chief of the Imperial Staff, announces to me that since the morning the enemy has been making fierce attacks on Bir Hakeim, but that Vichy has instructed Koenig to take up a new position if he succeeds. The operation should take place during the night. The next morning, June 11, is the enthusiastic and gloomy commentary of radio and newspapers. Since no one knows that the French are trying to get out of the encirclement, everyone obviously expects any minute that their resistance will be broken. Again in the evening, Brooke sends me the following news. General Koenig and most of his troops have reached El Gobi and are out of the enemy's reach. I thank the messenger, release him, and close the door. I am left alone with myself. My heart is pounding with excitement. A feeling of immense pride overwhelms me. Tears of joy flow. The 1st Light Motorized Division had approximately 5,500 men before the Battle of Bir Hakeim, and after 2 weeks of fighting, Koenig withdrew from there about 4,000 soldiers fit for further service. Some wounded were taken to the rear with the units. Our troops left 1109 officers and soldiers killed, wounded or missing on the battlefield. Among the killed were 3 senior officers, Lieutenant Colonel Broche, Majors Save and Bricon. Among the wounded who remained on the battlefield are Majors Pouchoy and Babineau. We had to leave some of the previously destroyed combat equipment. But the losses we inflicted on the enemy 3 times exceeded our losses. On June 12, the Germans announced that the day before they had stormed Bir Hakeim. Then the Berlin radio published the following communique. Since the French, white and coloured, captured at Bir Hakeim, do not belong to the regular army, they will be shot according to military law. An hour later, I asked for the following statement to be broadcast on the BBC in all languages. If the German army dishonours itself by killing French soldiers taken prisoner while they were fighting for their homeland, General de Gaulle must inform me that, to his deep regret, he will be forced to do the same to the Germans captured by his troops. By the end of the day, Berlin radio announced, there can be no doubt about the French soldiers captured during the fighting for Bir Hakeim. General de Gaulle's soldiers will be treated as soldiers, and so it was in reality. While the 1st Light Motorized Division regrouped in Sidi Barrani and Katru started its replenishment without delay, our air group Al-Sa continued to take part in the intensified actions of the British fighter Aviation, and our air group Lorraine increased the frequency of raids on enemy communications together with the bombers of the British Air Force. At the same time, our parachutists performed brilliant operations. For example, on the night of June 12-13, groups of parachutists destroyed 12 aircraft at enemy airfields in Libya, and Captain Berger dropped by parachute with several soldiers on the island of Crete. managed, before he was captured, to set fire to 21 bombers, 15 trucks and fuel depot at the airfield in Kandy. However, the Eighth Army, suddenly gripped by morale fatigue, withdrew from Cyrenaica, leaving a considerable amount of combat equipment in place. General O'Kinloch had hoped to retain at least Tobruk, a strongly fortified fortress supplied from the sea, but on June 24, the garrison, numbering 33,000 men, surrendered to the Germans. Only with great difficulty, the British managed to gain a foothold on the heights of El Alamein. One section of the position was held by the 2nd Light Motorized Division under the command of General Cazo, finally put into action. Among the reserves was Colonel Remy's tank group, urgently supplied with materiel. The situation was grave. The whole East, gripped by anxiety, awaited the entry of the Germans and Italians in Cairo and Alexandria. But this decline in the spirits of our allies, as events have shown, was only temporary. There was to come a day when the dominance of the sea, new reinforcements, the apparent superiority of aviation, and finally, the military ability of General Montgomery. They finally overcome this temporary weakness. However, Romney's troops, whose combat supplies were running low, suspended their advance. However, the situation particularly emphasized the great importance of our actions. General O'Kinloch nobly recognized this. On June 12, he issued a remarkable communique in honor of the 1st Light Motorized Division. The United Nations, he said, should be filled with feelings of admiration and gratitude for the actions of these French troops and their gallant general. 6 days later in London, 10,000 Frenchmen, military and civilian, gather for a solemn assembly to mark the 2nd anniversary of the draft on June 18. All 4 floors of the Albert Hall are filled to capacity, as far as security instructions allow. A huge tricolor banner emblazoned with the Cross of Lorraine stretches behind the podium and draws the eyes of all present. Finding a stirring response in the hearts, the Marseillaise and the March of Lorraine are heard. As I take my seat, surrounded by members of the National Committee and volunteers who have recently arrived from France, I hear the enthusiastic crowd shouting their aspirations to. On this day, along with hope, I experience jubilation. I make a speech. It is necessary. Heroes accomplish feats of struggle, but it takes fiery words to inspire them to do the deed. To quote Chamfort's saying, reasonable men have languished, but only men of great passions truly lived. I am reminded of the path taken by Free France in 2 years. We have had to endure a lot because we are people of great passions, but we've also had a lot of slogging. Ah, how judicious we are. We have said from the very first day, France is not out of the war. A power established by abandoning the national interest is not a legitimate power. Our alliances are not broken. We prove it by armed struggle. Of course, we had to believe that Great Britain would stand firm, that Russia and America would be drawn into the struggle, that the French people would not reconcile themselves to defeat, and, well, we were not wrong. I then salute our fighters around the world and the members of the resistance movement in France. I also salute the Empire, the loyal Empire, the original base for the rebirth of the country. Of course, its structure will need to be changed after the war, but France unanimously intends to preserve its unity and territorial integrity. Even the unfortunate courage with which the troops, entangled in the lies of Vichy, defend this or that possession of the Empire against fighting France and her allies, is a perverse but undeniable proof of this adamant French will. I state that, against all odds, battling France is resurfacing on the surface of the ocean. When the ray of reviving glory illuminated at Bir Hakeim the bloody heads of her soldiers, the world recognized France. The audience responds with tumultuous approval. The national anthem is sung with exceptional enthusiasm. Its sounds reach the French who, behind locked doors, drawn curtains and closed shutters, sit near their radios. The cheers fall silent. The meeting ends. Everyone returns to his post. And here I am alone with myself. Now, in this ordinary environment, I can look at the facts without illusions. I summarize the past. It's a positive but brutal summation. The fighting men joined the ranks of fighting France one by one. Its building was erected one brick at a time. And now it has become a solid and cohesive organization. But to achieve this, how much loss, how much grief and despair. And now we are entering a new phase of the struggle with considerable resources. 70,000 armed soldiers, experienced military commanders, active help from overseas territories, an internal resistance that will expand, a government to be obeyed, a power, if not recognized, at any rate known to the whole world. There is no doubt that events will awaken new forces. However, I am clearly aware of the obstacles that stand in my way, the might of the enemy, the ill will of the Allied states and on the part of the French, the hostility of official and privileged persons, the intrigues of a few, the passivity of the majority, and, lastly, the threat of general disaster. And I, a weak man, will I have enough shrewdness, firmness, skill to emerge victorious from all the trials? But even if I succeed in leading the United Nations to victory, what future awaits it? And on this way, how many new hardships and how many new strife await it? And when the danger is over and the festive rejoicing is over, how many torrents of filth will come upon France? But enough of doubts, standing above the abyss to the bottom of which the motherland has fallen. I, her son, call out to her and light her path to salvation. Many have already joined me. Others will follow, I am sure of it. France is already answering me. Here she rises from the bottom of the abyss, rising higher and higher. O mother country, we are ready to give you all our strength.